Whoever said that Vietnam is not worth learning about was clearly a liar. The country has had a rich and unique history for thousands of years, yet it remains one of the least understood countries in the world. We are here to put an end to this terrible injustice today. So without further ado, let's get into our video. To really understand Vietnam, you need to start at the beginning. Long before China became a major player on the world stage, Vietnam used to be known as During the 1st century CE, this civilization thrived thanks to their mastery of irrigation and agriculture in the Mekong River Delta. They developed a sophisticated water management system that allowed them to farm rice on a massive scale, which led to population growth and prosperity. But like many great civilizations, they weren't able to stay independent forever. In the year 111 CE, the Chinese Han dynasty conquered the region, and from then until the 9th century, Vietnam would be ruled over by a variety of Chinese powers. Throughout this time, the Vietnamese people were largely kept under the thumb of their Chinese rulers, who exploited their labor and collected heavy taxes. However, this all changed with the arrival of a legendary Vietnamese queen named Thu Da. She led a rebellion against the Chinese that resulted in her being named the first female emperor of Vietnam. Although she only reigned for 4 years, her legacy lived on and inspired future generations to fight for independence. Unfortunately, it would take centuries for Vietnam to become completely free from Chinese influence. After a brief period of autonomy, the Chinese returned to conquer Vietnam once again. This time, they would rule for nearly a millennium. Things didn't get better during the 13th and 14th century Mongol Yuan dynasty either. The Mongols were notorious for their brutality, and they wasted no time in imposing their dominance on the Vietnamese people. They forced the population to pay exorbitant taxes, and they even went as far as to resettle the people in different parts of Vietnam to disrupt local power structures. But the Vietnamese people were tired of living under the thumb of the Chinese, and they were ready to fight back. And they did just that. Under the leadership of a man named Le, he united the Vietnamese people and led them to victory over the Chinese, finally ending their 1,000-year reign over Vietnam. Vietnam was now its own empire once again. Le Loi established the Le dynasty in 1428 and set about the task of rebuilding the country after centuries of Chinese rule. His efforts paid off, and Vietnam entered into a golden age during his reign. The arts and culture flourished and the economy grew. But sadly, this wouldn't last forever. After Le Loi's death, his successors began to lose control of the central regions of Vietnam, allowing rival kingdoms to emerge. To make matters worse, the Chinese were looking for an opportunity to reclaim Vietnam, and they saw the internal conflict as the perfect chance. They sent in their army and quickly overwhelmed the weakened Vietnamese forces. With the Le dynasty collapsing, Vietnam found itself once again under the control of the Chinese. But the Vietnamese people were not going to accept this defeat lying down. Under the leadership of a man named Nguyen Hue, they rose up in rebellion against their Chinese oppressors. The rebellion was brutal and bloody, but ultimately successful. Nguyen Hue was proclaimed the emperor of a new dynasty. At this point, you might think that Vietnam's troubles were over, but you'd be wrong. Shortly after the Tay Son took power, neighboring Cambodia invaded Vietnam. The war was devastating and resulted in hundreds of thousands of deaths. Once the dust had settled, the Vietnamese had emerged victorious, but at a great cost. The war had left the country in ruins, and the Tay Son dynasty was crumbling. It was at this point that the French began to take interest in Vietnam. They saw the Tay Son dynasty as a weakened and vulnerable power that could easily be exploited. The French began to encroach upon Vietnam's territory, and soon the entire country was under French control. Vietnam was now a French colony, and the Vietnamese people were subjected to harsh treatment. The French exploited the Vietnamese for their labor and resources, and they also tried to suppress their culture and identity. In response, the Vietnamese people began to resist the French occupation, but their efforts were brutally crushed. However, there was one group of Vietnamese people who refused to give up. They were known as the Ho Hao, and they believed that armed resistance was the only way to end the French occupation. Their leader, a man named Hien Phu, launched a full-scale rebellion against the French. Unfortunately, the rebellion was eventually crushed, and Hien Phu was executed. Despite this setback, the Vietnamese people's desire for independence did not fade away, and it would be rekindled in the early 20th century with the rise of a man named Ho Chi Minh. He was a charismatic leader who advocated for Vietnamese independence through armed struggle. Under his leadership, the Viet Minh launched a war of independence against the Japanese, who had taken control of Vietnam during World War II. The war was long and arduous, but ultimately successful. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation once again, and the Vietnamese people celebrated their hard-won freedom. Sadly, this freedom would be short. The First Indochina War began when the French refused to accept the end of their colonial rule. It was a brutal conflict that lasted for 8 years. But in 1954, the Vietnamese finally emerged victorious. The Geneva Accords were signed, which divided Vietnam into 2 separate zones, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. At this point, you might think that Vietnam was finally at peace, but you'd be sorely mistaken. Tensions between the North and the South were high and soon they would erupt into the Vietnam War. The war was extremely divisive, and it quickly became a battle of communism versus democracy. The North was supported by communist allies such as the Soviet Union and China, while the South was supported by the United States. Over the course of the next 10 years, millions of lives would be lost, and entire villages would be wiped off the map. But despite the unimaginable horrors of the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese people remained steadfast in their determination to win their freedom. In 1975, the North finally captured Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, and the Vietnam War came to an end. Vietnam was now a unified country once again, but it was a very different place than it had been before the war. The country was in ruins, and the people were traumatized. However, despite all the challenges that they faced, the Vietnamese people were determined to rebuild their country and create a better future for themselves. In the years since the war ended, Vietnam has experienced remarkable growth and prosperity. The country has undergone a process of rapid industrialization and modernization, and it has become one of the most rapidly developing economies in the world. Vietnam has also become a major tourist destination, known for its beautiful beaches, lush jungles, and ancient temples. So that is the story of Vietnam, a country with a long and painful history of foreign domination, but also a country that has shown incredible resilience and determination to win back its freedom and build a better future for itself. If you enjoyed learning about Vietnam, please leave us a comment below. We hope that you have enjoyed this whirlwind tour through Vietnam's rich and complex history, and we encourage you to continue exploring our channel for more educational content. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.